Today is April 2nd, Hans Christian Andersen's birthday. Hans Christian Andersen is one of the most famous writers of fairy tales. And it's interesting because most of our fairy tales come from like Grimm's or the different colored fairy books by Andrew Lang. And all of these fairy tales are actually compiled from old oral traditions that have been passed down and down and down. These are stories that parents have told their children. But Hans Christian Andersen was a bit more of a composer of fairy tales. He actually wrote the stories that are in his books. He didn't just find them and polish them up a bit. From Andersen we get some of our very favorites. The Little Mermaid, The Steadfast Tin Soldier, The Ugly Duckling. And a couple of things make Andersen special and set him apart from everyone else. First, his characters are more dynamic and more vibrant than a lot of the heroes in fairy tales. A lot of times, heroes in fairy tales don't even have names. They're just a merchant, a soldier, a third son, but Andersen's stories have more depth to them. Tina Nunley, in her notes at the beginning of her own translation of Andersen, says, "In spite of the flawed English translations, Andersen's tales have managed to resonate in our hearts for so many years because he recognized that life is both ruthless and full of joy. His stories tell us something about the human condition, while at the same time they entertain and sometimes scare us. They show us that going out into the wide world can be both dangerous and wonderful. There will be many obstacles and trials, but it will also be adventurous and fun, and unexpected help will appear along the way." A second thing that sets Andersen apart from some of the other fairy tales is the way he tends to play with our emotions more than other fairy tales. Other fairy tales may teach common morals, like don't go into the woods by yourself, don't talk to strangers, like in Little Red Riding Hood. Hans Christian Andersen actually makes us feel the characters, and feel the emotions of the characters. We feel the outcast ugly duckling, who is actually a swan and doesn't know it. We feel the struggles of the steadfast tin soldier, who hangs up and stays standing up straight, no matter what happens to him and how grueling his experience is. We see the agony of the Little Mermaid, who desires to be human, and who keeps sacrificing herself again and again for others. She loses her tail, she loses her voice, in the end she loses her life and becomes sea foam. All because no one will love her in return. So Andersen does something that no other fairy tales do. He shows us the pain of human existence. A.S. Byatt, at the conclusion of her book Ragnarok, has a section called Thoughts on Myths. In there she talks about Andersen and Grimm, and she says about Andersen, "Hans Andersen did not write impersonal fairy stories of this kind, or not often. He wrote nuanced stories with characters, personalities, and feelings in them. Authored stories, works of the imagination. I felt he was trying to frighten or hurt me as a reader. I still think he was." But in spite of the pain of Hans Christian Andersen, and in spite of the way he wrings our hearts, there's still something about the stories that matter. There's something that helps us to try to latch on to our own experience and wrestle with it, and try to overcome it. The characters in his stories may be even more heroic because they do suffer, because they do struggle with grief and with pain and loss, just like all of us do in life. Andersen himself was occasionally shy and not particularly personable. And so one of the things he did in order to try to deal with company that he didn't know how to deal with was he started making paper cutout art. I call it the juggler. And here is a Lovecraftian-inspired creature and a little one-eyed monster. So today, for Hans Christian Andersen's birthday, go out and read a fairy tale. Read a fairy tale to a child. Remember that fairy tales are important to all of us, children and adults alike. Find a little bit more beauty and magic out there in the world today.